As the EU CBAM and the UK CBAM are the only two that are imminently on the horizon, I'd like to spend a bit of time going into the details of the differences between them. So both regimes have been designed to target the most carbon-intensive products. The EU has selected steel, iron, aluminium, cement, fertilizer, hydrogen, and electricity as those products. You may be wondering how electricity can be imported. Well, there are large interconnectors between the UK and the EU, between Norway and the EU, between North Africa and EU countries, and some from Moldova and other Eastern European countries. I believe there are exemptions for Norway because Norway is producing electricity in a manner that is compliant with the EU's emissions trading scheme. But those imports of electricity coming from Morocco, for example, into Spain will be subject to CBAM. These CBAM regimes are both expected to expand. So the UK's initial consultation included ceramics and glass, but it was decided that this was too complex to introduce in the first round. But there is a stated expectation that this list will be revised both for the EU and the UK by 2030. The EU in particular is looking at organic chemicals and polymers. So that's things like plastics and petrochemical that are imported in large quantities, particularly from Russia and Eastern Europe and the United States and the Middle East. So important to keep an eye out on it, even if you're not affected by either CBAM regime today. The way that the two regimes are asking for data collection is slightly different. So as I've mentioned before, the UK refers to embodied carbon and the EU to embedded carbon, but they're very, very similar concepts. In the UK, actual data is completely fine to use if available and verifiable, but otherwise importers are encouraged to use default values that are provided by the Treasury, and they'll be updated by the Treasury. And the reason that you might want to use your actual values rather than the default values is that if your supply chain is much more advanced in its carbon reduction than the average, you'll be able to reduce the amount of CBAM liability that you need to pay. And so that is a cost benefit analysis that each importer needs to make for themselves. Is it valuable to engage with supply chain and expend that effort in data gathering to reduce the CBAM liability, or will the default values be sufficient? And that, I think, really depends on the quantity that you're importing and on what your supply chain has already done to decarbonize. And this is the kind of decision that we can support you with making if your business is looking at this. And in contrast, the EU requires actual verified data unless the importer can prove that it's unavailable. And by verified, that means that a third party, and typically I think this is going to be people like Deloitte, PwC, that is accredited by the EU, must have verified your supply chain data. Or as an importer to the EU, you must be able to provide proof that you were unable to get this data from your supply chain. And I think the more default data that you're using, the more scrutiny you will come under from the EU. And the EU have clearly stated that their default data will be based on the worst performing EU installations rather than the UK's, which is going to be an average. So the EU is really driving importers to use actual data, whereas the UK is a little bit more pragmatic. And we see this difference in pragmatism and driving for perfection when we look at other comparables. So under both regimes, the importer is the responsible party. The EU is coming in a little bit earlier from January 2026, although, as I mentioned earlier, we are in a transitional phase. And what that means is that all of the digital infrastructure is live. Importers are being encouraged to set up CBAM accounts and report throughout this period so that they can get into the habit of collecting and reporting on that data. But from January 2026, they will need to pay the CBAM liability. Whereas in the UK, we're just going to start live from January 2027. There won't be a transitional period. The kinds of importers that are in scope vary between the two regimes. And so in the EU, if you import anything over €150 worth of in-scope goods, whether that's steel, aluminium, electricity, in a single accounting period, you must register with your country of residency's CBAM register and begin reporting on CBAM. So that's a lot lower than in the UK, where it's £50,000 worth of goods per rolling period, 12-month rolling period. And again, that difference is kind of crucial because a single accounting period is fixed, whereas in the UK, you've got that flexibility for a 12-month rolling period. So if you make one order per year of €200 in the EU, you must report. But if you make one order per year of €100, depending on what time of year you make that report, you might still be caught in needing to report. Whereas that 12-month rolling period in the UK gives you a little bit more flexibility that you can time your deliveries to make sure that you don't need to report if you are a smaller business. And again, these higher thresholds for the UK are really designed on trying to alleviate frictions for SMEs. The mechanism for paying the CBAM liability is different in both regimes. Again, the UK is a little bit simpler. It's a quarterly, very similar to a VAT return. You have to submit a quarterly CBAM return, and at the end of the year, pay a CBAM liability payment in the same way that you pay any other tax liability payment. Whereas in the EU, you will need to trade CBAM certificates, and CBAM certificates are linked to the emissions trading scheme, which means that their value varies. And so, particularly for larger importers, a trading strategy is going to be really, really important to decide what time of year you want to buy your CBAM certificates. It's going to be important to forecast how much material you're planning to import so that you can get an idea of the quantity of certificates that you need. And there will be upside to be had potentially on buying low and selling to your competitors high, in the same way that we've seen clever companies in the ETS regime manage their emissions trading certificates to actually create a profit rather than a liability. In the EU, you need to report every quarter. In the UK, you need to submit a final annual report and make one annual payment. Again, less friction under the UK's regime.